Micha I'll say it again, you are CEO of Peninsula Group and founder of Stop Incitement Movement. And Micha, your father, Richard Lakin, was murdered by Palestinian terrorists not far from here a few months ago in Jerusalem. And after that tragic event, you checked out the internet. What did you find there? And in retrospective, was there any option to stop it, to stop that specific terror action? No? Microphone? Someone?
It's on? You're
Yes,
oh, great. Yeah.
it's on.
Now I'm on too, so that's good. I want to first thank Nitzana and Avi for inviting me to speak here. I was a little humbled and overwhelmed when I looked at all the other people who were speaking on this panel and earlier today and yesterday. I'm going to take a few minutes of your time and kind of tell you a bit about our personal story, walk you through a journey that we've been through, and hopefully leave you with some insight onto the topic of the conference and answer all of Danny's questions in less than 10 minutes. And my father, and I think some of the people in the room, certainly my mother, who's here somewhere, knew him quite well. He was a good person. He was a kind person. He was an elementary school principal, dedicated his life to educating children, wrote a book on education called Teaching as an Act of Love. The basic premise of that book was every child is a miracle that needs to be nurtured. Throughout his life, he worked for civil rights causes, marched with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in the States as an elementary school principal, integrated one of the first, maybe the first school in Connecticut that was integrated, and set up a summer camp that was also integrated. When we moved to Israel, my parents founded a small English as a second language school where they taught probably some of your children. And that school was open to Muslim and Christian and Jewish children, and my father had been active in various coexistence movements here in Israel, and I think, maybe the highlight as a grandfather of 8 children here in Israel, got to educate them and spend time with them. And about 8 months ago, I was in what at the time seemed a very, very important business meeting in Tel Aviv, and my mother called me, and she said, there's been this horrible pigua in Armon Hatziv, and I've been calling Dad for 10 minutes, and he's not answering. And he was a real hypochondriac and a bit neurotic, and anytime there was an attack anywhere in the world, even if it was in Yemen, he would call us within minutes to tell us he was okay. So I immediately knew something was wrong, and I just got up and walked out and got in the car and started driving to Jerusalem and calling around to the hospitals. He'd gotten on that bus on his way back from a doctor's appointment, not knowing that there were 2 terrorists sitting on the bus waiting for him and a group of others. After the bus got going and the bus filled up, the 2 terrorists stood up, Baal Yan and Bilal Abu Ghanem. I'll never forget those names. One of them shot him in the head and several other people. And after he fell to the ground, the other one took out a knife and began stabbing him in the head and the face, cut his chest wide open. When I arrived at the hospital, he was there unconscious, and I was met by Neila, an Arab nurse who's the head of the emergency services, and she was crying, and she said to me, I was at your father's house last week with my 2 sons who he was teaching. And our family, we spent 2 weeks, or almost 2 weeks, at Hadassah Hospital, which did an incredible job trying to save his life. He was unconscious the entire time, but unfortunately, obviously, they were not able to. And during those 2 weeks, we had a lot of time to think, and I don't know who's spent time waiting, and I wouldn't wish it upon anybody, but waiting around the ICU. There's kind of this empty, quiet room, and you've got, Wi-Fi. So I spent 2 weeks on the computer asking myself the following questions. What could bring 2 20-year-olds to do something so horrible, so evil? They were middle-class kids from Jabal Mukhaber who had jobs and seemingly normal lives. How is this terror spreading so quickly and so rapidly around the world? I mean, you look at almost any statistic from any organization, and the easiest to look at is Wikipedia. Just type in list of Islamic terror attacks, and you see that the list over the past 20 years is going like this. It's growing almost exponentially and spreading around the entire world. And I asked her, what do we do to stop this? 2 days after the attack, I saw a video on the internet that the Hamas Student Union put out. I would show it to you, but I just can't watch it. Again, it's a reenactment of the attack, and it went completely viral and was viewed by millions of people all over the world. It's still out there on YouTube if somebody wants to look for it. And I started digging into this issue of incitement online and looking at these videos. We saw some examples of static websites here, but they're horrific motivational material, horrific instructional material. And as I asked what could make two people do something like that, I realized if you're sitting 4 or 5 hours a day watching this stuff, it has an effect on your mind. I watch my children. I have 4 little kids. They watch Barney. And they watch Yuval Mebulbal for those Israelis here, and he taught them this line, "Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha," which they believe is from Yuval Mebulbal. But for those of you, but they learned the lesson from watching this over and over again. And people who watch hatred and incitement and motivation to kill Jews and to kill Westerners are going to be impacted like that. And it's completely out of control. And for most people, it's not something that they're so aware of. And I said to myself, how do we stop this? And I realized that these new kind of, I'll call them continents, have risen up: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, with billions, hundreds of billions of users. And they're the platform that facilitates the spread of this information, whether it be motivation and whether it be instructional. They're not the generators, but they're the facilitators. They're the pipe that passes it along. And all of this information goes through a couple pretty small pipes in California. And if one wants to slow down the spread of terror, wants to slow down the spread of that exponential growth, the first thing one needs to do is to cut it off at the pipe, or to slow it down at the pipe. And so I wrote an op-ed, and I said I'm going to put this in the New York Times, perhaps, although not the most intuitive place for most of us Israelis, or most friendly, probably the most influential place in the world. And I called up a friend in New York, and I said, it's Thursday afternoon, how do I get an op-ed in the New York Times on Monday morning? He said, you probably don't get anything to the New York Times ever. And I passed it along to the editor, and he called me back about an hour later. He said, this is great, and I've been thinking about this for 2 years, and it's time that we put this out there. And he published my op-ed under the title Facebook Intifada, basically talking about this concept and saying that it's time to call on these social media companies to take responsibility. I then started a sort of movement to create pressure on the social media companies to slow down the spread of incitement. And we had 3 ideas. One is to put pressure on their brand by just discussing this in public, writing about it, getting people to write about it, putting up movies about it. Another is to file lawsuits, where Nisana and Avi and Shuat Adin have been incredibly helpful. They were the first ones to step up to sue Facebook. And there's a slew of copycat suits from all different directions, which I think is great, because it's increasing the pressure every day. And of course, Revital has been pushing through legislation in Israel and been talking to regulators around the world. And it's creating a pressure storm for these companies. There's still a long, long way to go. But that's the direction to slow it down. Now, I looked at the topic of the compact, towards a new law of war. And over the past 8 months, I've been spending an incredible amount of time talking with experts and opinion leaders around the world, trying to understand what's going on in terms of global terror and how do we slow it down. And what I realized, and Danny, I'm going to be finished here in a minute, is that we're thinking about it all wrong. We being the Western world, and all of the great efforts that people are putting into thinking about it, whether it be legislation, incredibly important conferences like this, newspaper articles, security agencies. We're missing the point. We're talking about organizations. People talk about Al-Qaeda. They talk about ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah. We talk about operations. We talk about leaders. We got to get bin Laden. I definitely wanted to get him. One of my best friends was killed in 9/11, and I was pretty angry about that. It was everybody else, and that's a good target, but not really the issue. And we talk about these lone wolves, who I think is accurately pointed out here are not really lone wolves. And after 8 months of talking to people, I realized how we need to reframe this question. And by reframing the question, we can then understand all of our future thinking. We need to call it what it is. And what it is open source jihad. I'm going to say that again, open source jihad. Now, open source, for those of you who aren't familiar, and there are probably very few people today who aren't, it's the concept of a software program or an information database which grows by itself. There's no one leader, there's no person in charge. Nobody gets to decide what gets added to it, what gets taken away, and where it goes. So this is open source. Al-Qaeda, Hamas, individuals at home who are making motivational films, or lone wolves who are running out and doing individual operations, they're part of this open source jihad. Jihad obviously being holy war. In every one of these terror attacks, the person is screaming, Allahu Akbar, and they find a Quran somewhere in their house or in their bag. And I'm not saying, I don't have any issue with Islam Muslims, I have an issue with jihadists, and it's very clearly a jihadist problem. So open source jihad, and anybody who is involved in that, anybody who is putting up websites, anybody who is building organizations, anybody who is carrying out attacks, they're mujahideen. There's a word for it in Arabic, mujahid, which is basically a warrior in the holy war. And I didn't come up with this term, open source jihad. Actually, Al-Qaeda came up with the term, and ISIS, and it's been put out in their internal newsletters, and it's a concept that they're putting out there. And if we want to understand this, if we want to deal with it, we need to call it what it is, open source jihad. And then when we think about regulation, when we think about operations, when we think about how to deal with it, we'll understand it correctly. And it's gonna, another 30 seconds, it's gonna create some very big challenges. First of all, because it's open source, there's no bricks and mortars, there's no borders. Most of it happens on social media, on the internet, on mobile telephones, things that are not regulated at all. And it's going to force us to revisit some of our basic rights. Open source jihad is the new Nazism. It's at that level that if you take that exponential growth and take it 10 years into the future, it's going to be destroying our world. And for us to deal with it, we're going to have to go back and revisit some of our basic rights. Unfortunately, we're going to have to revisit free speech. My 10-year-old has a YouTube page. Thousands of people can go up and look at it. There's no issue of free speech anymore. Anybody can get up and get out any message. The issue is the opposite. Where do we limit free speech, not how do we protect it? That's the new issue. The presumption of innocence. So that's a very important Western value that I believe in. However, if you're a radicalized jihadist sitting at home getting ready to go out and do an attack, and you've got guns in your house which you purchased legally, and you've got tons of jihadist material, and your mind is there, and we can know that from the internet, from phone calls today, there's nothing any Western legal authority can do about that. And because of our privacy concerns, which I value very much, we're not going to go into your computer, we're not going to go into your phone to understand this and analyze it, we're not going to monitor your traffic. So I'm not saying throw out those basic values, definitely not. They're core to Western society, but in order to deal with open source jihad, we're going to have to be willing to revisit them. Thank you.
Thank you, Micha. Toda, Micha Laking.